I like sending people up here who don't usually like being up here, which is also the case for me. Speaking is not that enjoyable of a thing, but I am excited about the message today. I've actually been looking forward to Gene's message last week and this message today since the beginning of our series, because we are finally at the end of this Metamorphosis series. I'm not excited to end it, but because of the principle. It's just a passion of mine. I think it's a key to being a healthy person, and we'll get to that in a moment, but I want to start with a story. And this comes from Alcoholics Anonymous co-founder Bill Wilson. If you don't know his story, he was a struggling alcoholic in the 20s and 30s. And during that time, there weren't a lot of options. There wasn't a lot of help for someone that was dealing with any form of addiction, but alcoholism was widespread at the time, and people they were in trouble, and there weren't resources out there for even those that wanted to get better, except one resource, and that was these very, very expensive hospital sanitariums that you could go to if you had enough money to pay to be a visitor there, or be a patient there. And so if you got in, you went to one of these clinics, and you were basically put in a room all by yourself. You were isolated from all other interaction except for your doctor, who would come in from time to time and try to perform best practices with you on helping you recover. But unfortunately, recovery wasn't something that was well established, or there wasn't a lot of experiments or best practices at the time, so the best practices weren't really best practices. They were the only ones. They were guesses. And so Bill Wilson, fortunate for him, even though he was a successful businessman, he didn't even have the money to afford one of these sanitariums, but he had a rich uncle. And he sent him there 3 times. So he went once and relapsed, went again and relapsed. And on his 3rd visit, he went, and he was a smart guy, and he started saying, you know, I'm here again. This is the only thing out there to help me get better. But I want to do something different. I'm not going to go through the same process hoping for different results, because that's probably not going to take place. And so he shared with his doctor this theory. And if you get a little more into his story, you find out that he had what he called a spiritual awakening. He met God. He met Jesus, started following him. And this awakening, this experience with God, his conversion, led to this insight. And he said, what if my recovery is tied to community and helping other alcoholics? And so he went to his doctor and he said, you know, I'd like to do something different. Rather than being isolated in this room, even though you guys think it's the best way for me to recover and everyone else, could I spend some time, daily time, with other alcoholics here at the hospital and even in the streets, where I could share my story, hear their story, and encourage them? And the doctor said, well, you have nothing to lose, so you can try whatever you want. And so he tried it. And what he discovered is what we know of as the 12th step. It's the step about learning to be healthy and staying healthy as a person by caring for and helping other people. Gene introduced it last week. In the recovery world, it is the 12th step. But I want to read you the letter the doctor wrote after this whole thing took place. All right? So this is Bill Wilson's doctor at this clinic. It says, to whom it may concern, I have specialized in the treatment of alcoholism for many years. And in late 1934, I attended a patient who, though he had been a competent businessman of good earning capacity, was an alcoholic of a type that I had come to regard as hopeless. Speaking of Bill Wilson. In the course of his 3rd treatment, he acquired certain ideas concerning a possible means to recovery. As part of his rehabilitation, he commenced to present his conceptions to other alcoholics, impressing upon them that they must do likewise with still others. This has become the basis of a rapidly growing fellowship of these men and their families. This man and over 100 others appear to have recovered, he says. I personally know scores of cases where they've tried many different methods and they've all failed, but this one hasn't. These facts appear to be of extreme medical importance because of the extraordinary possibilities of rapid growth inherent in this group. They mark a new epoch in the annals of alcoholism. These men may well have the remedy for thousands of such situations. William Silkworth, MD. What he observed, that's right, what he observed is the principle that Gene taught last week, reciprocity, giving back what God has given to us. It's the service and care and attention to other people. Here at Cornerstone, we're loosely following the 12 steps. We felt that this 12th step about taking the message out to people who struggle as we do, whatever it is that you're working on during this series. The idea is that by serving, it'll actually help you transform and grow and stay healthy. And so Gene shared the idea last week, and I'm going to go some more, because we thought this principle is so important it doesn't deserve 1 week. It deserves 2. In fact, I want to say something else that's interesting about the recovery world. Today, they go through the 12-step process. But originally, when Bill and Bob started taking men through the process, they would get to steps 11 and 12 within a month. Today, often it takes recovery groups over a year to get to steps 11 and 12, prayer and service. They knew that without prayer and service early in the process, recovery was going to be difficult. In a sense, the entire thing works together, but steps 11 and 12, spending time with God, being with him, and serving others is the secret to continuing on in whatever growth or change that you want to see occur in your life. It covers addictions. It also just covers dysfunctional behaviors and dysfunctional ways of thinking. And so that's why this idea is so important. So what I'm calling step 12 today is this. It's more specific than last week. Last week was serving and caring for others. Today is we're trying to get to the sweet spot of what it means to serve and care for others. And I'm calling step 12 a calling made just for you. And the idea here is that God has called you and he has allowed your life to take place in such a way that he has built a calling just for you that not only helps other people, but it's the very thing that helps keep us healthy as individuals. See, serving is not just something healthy people do. People serve to stay healthy. Does that make sense? And that's the idea here. Serving is not just something we do to stay healthy. It's something that healthy people do. It's something we do to stay healthy. And so what I want to show you, I want to talk about calling and what calling is. Because there's a lot of confusion around it. I'm going to define it in a moment. I'm going to talk about how our calling is tied to our past and how when we make that connection, we see that our calling in the future has to do with the pain and wounds of other people. And so I want to show you those things and hopefully move us in a direction where we're in this sweet spot of beginning to serve and care for other people in our life. All right, this is how I'm going to define calling this morning. A calling is a God-directed service to others that is uniquely suited for you. Or in my case, it's a God-directed service to other people that's uniquely suited for me. It's individualized, it's personal, it has everything to do with your gifts, your talents, your interests, but most of all, it has everything to do with your story, which includes your wounds and your dysfunction. See, one of the problems, though, when people try to choose their calling is we quickly pass over our past. And we don't see how our past has everything to do with our calling. Our calling is God's directed service towards other people that's uniquely suited for each one of us. Identifying a calling can be difficult, and it can take some time. And by the way, most people have more than one. All right, there's this idea out there that everyone has one calling, and it's like some special code you have to crack. It's not true. Callings come and go in our life. They change. We can have more than one at a time. You can have a calling in the arts. You can have a calling as a businessman. You could be a businessman and not have that be your calling. So it's a complicated thing that we try to figure out over time. But what we do is we try to dial it in. We try to figure out what it is that God has uniquely suited us to do in this time and place. And my favorite illustration, I shared this last fall about calling, is dialing in a rifle. Do we have any shooters in here or hunters? Oh, this is because it's Boulder County. All right. Where I come from, everyone drives the trucks and has a gun. So my friends would get new rifles, and they put scopes on their rifles, and I've done this with my father-in-law from time to time, and we go out to a shooting range, and what you want to do is you want to dial in that aim, and so you'll put it on a tripod, and you'll make sure that gun is set in the same place, and you'll aim at the target, and you'll shoot. And after you shoot, you only take one shot as you walk all the way up to the target and you see where it is that that shot hit on the target. And if you have a continuation of many shots, like, for example, headed to the right of the bullseye, you know that your target, your aim is off a little bit. So you go back to your gun and you dial it in a little more, take a couple other shots, and you walk back to see where you're shooting. And it takes several shots and several walking up to the target and analyzing where you're hitting to finally dial in on the bullseye. Now, here's the thing with our life. Dialing in on your calling doesn't take minutes, it takes years. And that can be frustrating for people, but a calling is something that emerges over time. We could have more than one at a time, but God shows us this through our lives. But what I want to show you today is he shows us our calling through our wounds and our dysfunctions and our struggles. And the very thing that you said is in this box that you want to see change, God wants to use that to identify a calling in your life to help other people. Here are a couple problems that are a couple traps that we find ourselves in when we think about our calling. Most people we ask this question at some time or another in our life. What am I supposed to do? All right, so here are a couple problems, and these are things that we want to avoid. First of all, when we compare ourselves to other people, it's easy to look around and to look at someone else and say, you know what, they seem to have purpose and passion for their life. They seem to have figured out what it is that they're called to do, and we look at them and say, I wish I was like that. We compare ourselves. Or you know what else happens is we look at other people and we say, their calling, their gifting, the way that they serve is better than the way that I'm called to serve. I don't know any good that comes out of comparing. There are no benefits, especially when it comes to allowing God to lead us, because God is writing every one of our stories. They're all individual stories. We all have our own story, and when we compare ourselves to other people, we rob God the opportunity to show us what's unique about us. And so we don't want to compare ourselves, but here's another problem that many people have. It's that idea that there's only one thing out there that you're meant to do. Okay? If you read about calling in the scriptures, you see that people are called to many things. I'm going to show you that at the end of this message. We're called to many things. And over time, we dial it in even more and more into effectiveness. All right? So that's what a calling is. Now, here's how our calling is connected to our past. And when I say our past, I mean our wounds, and I mean our dysfunctions. The very things that we like to get past, right? I'd love to just move on beyond my wounds. I'd love to move on beyond my dysfunction. But God uses these things to show us what it is that he's called us to do. I'm going to tell you a couple stories. And this comes from a very, very good book I'd recommend. It's called David and Goliath. It's not a Christian book, but it has that title. It's by Malcolm Gladwell. Anyone hear of him? Wrote Outliers, Tipping Point, New York Times best-selling author. The book is excellent. Here's the thesis of the book, that some advantages in life are not advantages at all, and some disadvantages are not disadvantages, they become advantages. So he's talking about underdogs doing very, very well. And so he tells a number of stories about disadvantages becoming advantages. And here are a couple of my favorite. He cites studies in London that have found that over 1/3 of successful entrepreneurs have dyslexia. And close to half of successful CEOs and businessmen and women have dyslexia that they surveyed. A perceived disadvantage that became an advantage. But here's an example of where calling comes from, and this includes a group of people, not just individuals. This story is from World War II in Nazi-occupied France. There in the mountains, there was a community, a series of different villages where Jewish children were able to, if they made it there, were able to find refuge and safety and were able to be protected from the Nazis and the Holocaust. In fact, in one village that harbored over 300 Jewish children, they didn't lose one of them. What was interesting is the school went from something like 19 in its enrollment to a few years later to having 380. They said, yeah, everything looked suspicious. But there was a group of people there who were used to opposing the government. And they were used to opposing evil laws. It's a group of people called the Huguenots. And the Huguenots, if you don't know who they are direct descendants of the first Protestant reformers in France. Now, here's why that's interesting. The Protestant Reformation took place, the Reformation away from the Catholic Church. Well, France was primarily and mostly Catholic. And so you have the Huguenots moving away from the Catholic Church. That made the government of France and the Catholic Church at the time very angry. So for over 100 years, king after king rounded up the Huguenots, put them in jail for the rest of their life, killed them, took their kids from their home, put them in Catholic family foster homes to try to rid them of these Protestant ideas. And they, for over 100 years, were persecuted and hurt by their government. Now, here's what it did, the disadvantage. No one would ask for something like that, right? No one would ask for those wounds. But it made them very resilient. It made them very good at, made them very evasive. Made them very good at hiding things. And those skills that emerged over a couple hundred years were used in hiding Jewish children when Nazi officials would come into the village asking them where these kids are from. A disadvantage became an advantage. A wound became a calling. Do you see that? They were able to acquire certain skills that helped them into something that they were meant to do. Not one Huguenot in that village, I bet, after the war was over and they had saved those kids' lives, would say, we were not called to this. Not one of them asked for it, not one of them expected it, but everyone would say, this is something God has called us to do. So our wounds come from our past. But usually what happens is we try to discern our calling in different places. I'm going to mention a few of them. And I don't want to go too far and say that these aren't helpful ways in discerning your calling, but usually what we do is we just focus on these. The first way we discern our calling is we ask ourselves, what is it that I'm equipped to do? What is it that I'm gifted at, right? I've done this many times. What are my skills? And of course, God's only going to call me to the things that I'm good at and skilled at. But that's usually what we learn. And so we have elaborate spiritual gift tests that are around the church today that will tell us, here are your gifts. Now go out and figure out how to serve in just the area that you're gifted in, all right? So it's not a bad way, but it's just such a small way to determine our calling. But we look at that. We look at how we're equipped and what we're gifted at. Here's the second thing we do. We ask ourselves, what am I excited about? What am I passionate about? What makes me feel alive? And whatever those things are, we think, oh, God must call me to the things that I love. Well, if that were the case for me, I would be called to playing football on Sundays and not being here preaching to you. Those Huguenots weren't excited about their calling. Here's the third way we determine our call, is we say, what is it that's going to bring me great joy and satisfaction? What is it that really makes me, again, feel alive? What brings great joy and satisfaction? We take what we're gifted at, what we're excited about, and the joy we expect to get in return, and that's how we determine our calling. But you know what? We miss something. If you look at the people called in the Bible, and I'm going to give you several examples here in a moment, very rarely were they gifted, excited, and received joy in the calling God gave them. Their calling came from pain, their wounds, their dysfunction. It came from the way God had worked in their life in the past. They didn't ask for any of these things. So let me give you several examples of people like this. How about Joseph? Think Joseph wanted to be betrayed by his brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, to go away and to be a prisoner and a slave for decades before he was able to interpret a dream, became second in charge of the greatest country in the world, Egypt at the time, and allowed them to survive a great famine, and in so doing, saving the Egyptian culture, but also other cultures around them at the time, including his family. Now, what a great story, right? And along the way, God gave him gifts, and he gave him passions. But Joseph, when this whole thing started, wasn't equipped, wasn't excited, and didn't receive great joy during the process. What would have happened if he would have determined his calling based on those things? Or here's another example. How about Daniel? Daniel is one of the refugees during the exile. And King Nebuchadnezzar sacks his city, destroys his city, the city that he loves, Jerusalem, destroys his culture, kills his friends, kills his families, and picks up Daniel and others and hauls them off to a foreign city that's very different than the city that they love, where he's ordered to serve in the king's court. By the way, some of you might say, well, he got the gift of interpreting dreams. Well, he was put into his position before he ever interpreted a dream. Daniel is taken away. He's called to serve the king. Do you think he felt fully equipped to serve a corrupt king, his enemy in a pagan nation? Do you think that he was fully excited to be taken away and given the job that he had? Do you think he received great joy and satisfaction all along the process of serving this way? None of us would deny that that was Daniel's calling. He wouldn't as well. But he wasn't excited, equipped, and didn't experience a lot of joy. In fact, he's the only guy that did the right thing at times, and he was thrown in a den with lions. What would have happened if he would have determined his call the way we do? Or think of Ruth. I love Ruth. She married a Jewish man who had immigrated to her country to survive a famine in Israel. And as she marries this man, she's welcomed into this family, but tragedy hits the family, and her husband dies. And her father-in-law, the dad of her husband, dies. And her brother-in-law dies. And in the course of just a few months, you now have 3 widows living together in a country called Moab. Her mother-in-law, Naomi, decides that her only hope in life is to go back to Israel and hope that someone in her country will care for her. And she says to her daughter-in-laws, Ruth is one of them, you need to stay in this country. This is your only hope, and hope you find another husband. But what does Ruth do? She said, I'm going to go with you. I'm going to stay loyal to this relationship. I'm going to stick with you, mother-in-law. Even though we are both widows, I'm now going to be the immigrant living in a different country. We're going to have nothing together, but I'm attaching my future to my loyalty to you, to this relationship. Do you think that she felt equipped, excited, and was going to experience deep joy saying yes to this calling? She's a widow caring for a widow. Calling connected to her wounds, connected to her past, it led her into the future. Here's another example. I'll go more in detail with this one. This is Moses. And Moses is a good example because this is Passover. No one would deny that for, those 40 years that Moses led the Israelites through the desert, he had led the Exodus. He had taken a group of slaves living in a foreign country, and he had led them out of that place, and they were to go to a land of their own, and they were to no longer be slaves, but they were to be God's people. And during that time, the time of the Exodus, the Passover story, and those 40 years in the desert, no one would deny that Moses was saying yes to his calling. But do you think that he was excited, equipped, and would experience great joy in his calling? Not at all. Let me show you. As for being gifted, this is what Moses actually says about himself in chapter 4, verse 10. I'm not eloquent of speech, and I'm slow of speech. In other words, I'm not equipped for this. I'm not gifted in this. As for being excited, he says things over and over again like, who am I? And what if they don't believe me? And who am I to say that you are? It's just question after question. It's the opposite of excitement. It's fear. And as for experiencing great joy and satisfaction, chapter 4, verse 13 sums it all up. He says, Lord, please send someone else. Please send someone else. Now, this is not what we're told about how we're to serve people. What we're called to do. Usually if we say something like, oh, God, send someone else, we take that as a sign that this isn't for us. But God sends us back into the very dysfunction and difficult places that He's brought us from to care for others. Let me give you another example. I believe that every parent that has a kid is called to their children. So this has nothing to do with gifting or sometimes excitement or joy, but usually does, at least the last part. But every parent is called to their kid. Every mother, every father is called to their child. But how many first-time parents would describe those first several months as something I was equipped and ready for? Something that I'm absolutely excited about and something that gives me life and brings me joy? No, most first-time parents say it actually kind of feels like death. The lack of sleep, the difficulty, we don't know what we're doing, right? But they're called. And so my point is not to say that gifts and passion are not important, but we make them too important. And we fail to see how our wounds and our dysfunction from the past has everything to do with determining our calling today and in the future. And when we dial it in that way, God gives us something that will continue to bring health and life to us. Because healthy people continue to serve to stay healthy. So Moses is an example. Ruth, Daniel, parents, they're all examples of this type of thing. So how do we find our calling? I want to mention 3 areas before I close here. There's layers to a calling. There's layers to your service. There's layers to this principle of caring and serving other people. The first, what you could call, is the highest calling. And this is the calling that every human that has ever lived has, and that is to bear the image of God. It's to show God's character and quality to the world around us. Every human is called to do that. So we never have to question how we're to live. We're to live like God lives, okay? That's the highest calling. But under the highest calling is something called general calling. And general calling is a little more specific. It has to do with living like Jesus and caring about the things that he cares about and building what he is building. And Jesus is building his kingdom. And so general calling is about building his kingdom. And we do that where God has placed us, at work. So regardless of what your job is somehow included in these layers of calling. And so you build God's kingdom through your daily work. And you build God's kingdom through your relationship. And you build God's kingdom in this general calling through your stage of life. And so if you're a parent at home taking care of little kids, this is your stage of life. You build God's kingdom. Your general calling has to do with loving and caring for your family. Okay? So this can change over time, general calling. But the idea is that we build his kingdom with those that are around us and wherever he sends us. But this is where it gets dialed in. There's another layer, and it's called specific calling. And this is where we get some help. And specific calling has to do some with our gifts, but most of all, our specific calling has to do with where we've come from. Our past, our wounds, our dysfunctions. Have you ever noticed that people that are very, very effective with others and helping them overcome their struggles, they themselves overcame the same struggle? That's why AA sponsors are all former alcoholics. There's a great quote in the big book that says, a doctor, I'll sum it up. It says, a doctor can speak to an alcoholic, a wife or a husband can speak to an alcoholic, a good friend can speak to an alcoholic, and the alcoholic won't share. But as soon as he shares with someone that was an alcoholic themselves and has overcome that, they have trust and they can communicate and they can connect in moments. See, specific calling allows us to be effective because it allows us to do three things. It gives us understanding, empathy, and vision for the other people. I want to mention these. Understanding. When you minister out of your wounds and not your strengths, this is what happens. You have a greater understanding of the nature of the problem. I spent time with knucklehead young men all the time. I'm still coming out of that. But I know when they're lying to me. You know why? Because I understand their struggles. I understand the nature of the struggle. I even know when they're lying. I even know when they're hiding. See, when you minister out of your wounds, out of your past, it gives you understanding to help other people. It allows us to be very, very effective. This is why Jesus is the most effective person that has ever lived in helping people through their problems, because Jesus can sympathize with every single struggle and every wound. It's not just a big idea, but he literally felt everything and faced everything and was tempted in every way. And so because of that, he is helpful to us. It's out of his wounds that he cares for us. Here's a second strength of learning to minister out of your wounds and your past. It's empathy. Empathy is being able to feel what the other person feels. It's to share with them the suffering, the discomfort, the struggle, the discontent. And often we overlook empathy until you're the one suffering. And when you suffer, and I know many of you have, who are the people you love to be around? People who have gone through similar things and can share empathy with you, right? Think what a gift that is. A calling is service directed by God that's uniquely suited for you, but when you have empathy and you're able to share out of your wounds, you give someone service that is uniquely suited for them. And it makes a huge difference. And so you understand the problem and you're able to give empathy. And then here's the last thing that happens when we minister out of our wounds and not just our strengths. We find our calling this way is we have vision. When God has taken you somewhere, you have vision of what could be for a person who has no hope and has no vision. See, vision is not just what should or could be. All right, that's how a lot of people, what could be, that's our vision. Let's dream about things. But vision is what should be. And when you help someone who's just behind you in your same area of struggle or your same area of woundedness, you are able to give them a vision of what should be. Health, wholeness, care for others, God's story living out in your life, new creation. What was so great about Moses? He goes back to the Israelites who have, they've been praying for 400 years that God would help them. And as would be the case with anyone, when you pray for one thing for 400 years and you don't get any help, you might think that the person you're praying to isn't there, right? So Moses goes to them and says, God has sent me. He's seen your suffering, and I'm here to help you. And trust me, I've seen God. I've met with him. He loves you. He cares about you. And your destiny is to no longer be slaves, but to be his people. What did he do? He gave them a vision of what should be. When we learn that we have a calling that's made just for us, and it is connected to our passions and our gifts, but most of all, where God has taken us, our dysfunctions in the past and our wounds, we are able to give people a living hope of what could be. So that's why people who've gone through a divorce love to be with people who are going through a divorce. They're very effective. They're helpful. That's why struggling businessmen love being with businessmen who have done better, right? That's why when I go to see you and I see a bunch of athletes there at the Dell Ward Center who are very depressed because of their newest injury, and I tell them about blowing out my knee 4 different times, first of all, I get a look of shock, but right away I get their ears. And I can share with them, sports is not what you're meant for. It's not your life. Something you enjoy now, but your life is not over if this is taken away. See, our wounds allow us to be very, very effective. But what happens is often we discern our calling in different ways, or here's what else happens that's very, very sad. We don't even want to be used by God. We're more dedicated to other things. We're more dedicated to our careers, our comfort, our vacations, politics, than people, than God's kingdom. That's probably a reason why there's so much discontent and addiction in the world, I would think. If this 12th step helps us stay healthy, well, then it would make sense that when we serve ourselves, that it will lead to chaos and pain in our life. And so I'm sharing this with you today, hopefully not to give you a desire to serve out of obligation, but that you would have a desire for yourself to stay on this path towards health and healing, and that would come by being a part of what God is doing and serving uniquely as you are with your wounds and your scars. All right, I'm going to have the worship team come out, and we're going to transition here before I close in prayer to communion. And I'm going to make some connections here even to our own struggles. But this is my favorite time of the year, favorite week of the year to take the elements. Many people know here at Cornerstone, because we talk about this all the time, that when Jesus first took the bread and he took the cup and he said, this is my body broken for you and this cup represents my blood poured out for you. Many people here at Cornerstone know that that was a Passover Seder. It was during Passover. The Last Supper was a Seder. And so Jesus is together, as he was every year at this time, with his disciples. And they would get together and they would remember this story about how God had delivered them from slavery. But the way that God had delivered them is that God protected the Israelites from his judgment. Because what really convinced Pharaoh was this thing called the angel of death. It's kind of a scary story. God sent the angel of death, and it was going to strike down the firstborn in all of the land. Humans and animals, everyone. But if the Israelites were to take a lamb or a goat and to slaughter it and to put the blood over the doorpost, the angel of death would pass over them. Now here's what's neat about it. Every firstborn that morning after the Passover would have woken up and said, the only reason I'm alive is because someone else died. Every loved one of a firstborn. My family has 3 firstborns. Me, my wife, and my oldest son. The little boys, the 3 younger ones, would have been in trouble. But if you had a loved one that was the oldest, you would have been very grateful the next morning that they're alive, and you would have known that the reason they're alive is because a lamb died. Well, the night before Jesus was killed, he said, you know what, we're here to celebrate the Passover, but I want to make another connection. All future life for you and for everyone else who would trust in me will come because I'm willing to die. Anytime you enjoy good things in life, anytime you enjoy God's new creation in your life, anytime you enjoy God's renewal in your life, forgiveness, love, freedom from shame, the only reason that you can enjoy that is because someone else had to die. Life comes from death.